If you are offered a job in a remote, isolate place, would you take it? And what if that job came with a rule so bizarre it could cost you your life? That's exactly what happened to me. My name is Miguel, and until recently, I was just an ordinary young man, someone trying to make ends meet. I was always looking for something new, something to break the monotony of routine and, ideally, fill my pockets quickly. So, when I saw the online ad, it seemed like the perfect opportunity. Temporary work in the Arctic. Exceptional pay. All expenses covered. Immediate start. The description was vague, but something about it drew me in. Maybe it was the promise of adventure, of escaping the suffocating city and facing a wild, uncharted landscape. Or maybe it was the money, which seemed too good to be true. Without much thought, I sent my resume. To my surprise, the response came almost instantly. A formal email, with contract details and travel instructions. It was quick, straightforward, and strange. The more I read, the more I realized something didn't quite add up. The contract seemed ordinary at first glance, but as if I reached the end, one clause caught my attention. The lights must remain on. Always. I read it over and over, thinking it was a tip or some sort of joke. After all, what kind of rule was that? Even so, the pay was too good to pass up, and my curiosity got the better of me. Maybe it is just one of those safety regulations, I thought, trying to rationalize it. It probably gets really dark in the winter up there. Before I knew it, I was on a plane, flying over frozen seas and snow-covered mountains. The destination, a small, isolated village in the middle of nowhere, surrounded only by vast fields of ice and an oppressive grey sky. The journey there was surreal. Small planes, a helicopter, and finally, a motorized sled brought me to the site. When I arrived, I was greeted by a man with tired eyes and skin vetered by the cold. He introduced himself as Jonas, the manager. "You're Miguel," he asked, not even giving me time to take in the surroundings. I nodded, still clutching my bag. He gave a fine smile, but his eyes remained serious. "Good. Welcome. Before anything else, I need to reinforce the most important rule. I thought he was going to talk about safety protocols or something related to the extreme weather. But no. He looked straight into my eyes and said, "The lights must stay on. Always." I tried to laugh, hoping to lighten the strange atmosphere, but he didn't smile back. "I'm serious, Miguel. If the lights go out, you will be in danger. Real danger." In that moment, a chill ran down my spine, and it had nothing to do with the cold. The Arctic cold was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Each breath felt like it sliced through my throat, and the wind burned my skin even under heavy layers of clothing. When I finally caught sight of the village, it felt like I was stepping into another world. The building was old, a sturdy structure but visibly battered by time and weather. The silence around it was so intense it felt alive. No sounds except the wind, no movement except for the snow drifting through the air. It was as if the place had been frozen in time. When the motorized sled stopped, Jonas helped me carry my suitcase to the entrance. The metal door groaned loudly as I opened it, as if the village itself protested my arrival. As soon as I stepped inside, I was greeted by the smell of rust and oil. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly and flickered occasionally, casting shadows that danced on the concrete walls. Everything felt off, as if the building was barely holding itself together. "This is where you will be working," Jonas said, placing my suitcase on the floor. "Mr. Erickson is waiting for you inside." I followed Jonas down a narrow hallway, the sound of our footsteps shone uncomfortably. We arrived at a small room, where a tall, thin man was waiting for us. Vi headshot grave and piercing eyes that semi to body anionigo daret to vou de vis gaze fortulong. You must be Miguel, vi said, his voice deep and firme. Yes, sir, he replied, trying to sound confident, though my stomach was in knots. He studied me for a moment before stepping closer. I'm Erickson, the supervisor here. Jonas has probably already mentioned the most important rule, but I'll say it again so you don't forget. I expected him to mention the dangers of ice or the extreme isolation, but what he said caught me off guard. Never let the lights go out. No matter what happens. I tried to hide my discomfort, but he noticed. I know it sounds strange, he continued, crossing his arms. But that's the only thing you need to remember. If the lights flicker, replace the bulbs immediately. If the generator fails, fix it. No matter the time, no matter the reason, the lights must stay on. Understood? I nodded, still unsure of what I'd gotten myself into. Understood. He gave me one last look, as if assessing whether I could follow orders. Then he turned to Jonas. Show him the rest of the place, and explain his tasks. I want everything running smoothly. Jonas nodded, and began guiding me through the warehouse. As we walked, I couldn't stop thinking about what Erickson had said. The lights, why were they so important? With each corridor we passed, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. Rusty metal shelves towered to the ceiling, filled with boxes labeled with codes I couldn't understand. More fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered, casting unsettling flashes across the shadows that seemed to move. You'll get used to it, Jonas said, interrupting my thoughts. Everyone finds it strange at first. But trust me, it's better to keep the lights on. Why? I asked, finally mustering the courage. He hesitated for a moment before replying. Because when the lights go out, things happen. The warehouse felt even more intimidating at night. The constant hum of the fluorescent lights above was nearly deafening in the absolute silence. Every creak, every echo was amplified by the concrete walls. It felt as if the entire place was alive, watching. I was alone now. Jonas and Mr. Erickson had retired to their quarters, leaving me responsible for monitoring the warehouse through the night. The task seemed simple enough. Ensure the lights stayed on and the generator kept running. But in practice, the oppressive silence and the darkness outside made my heart pound faster. As I walked the corridors, trying to familiarize myself with the layout, I noticed the generator for the first time. It was massive, taking up almost half of an adjacent room. The low, steady hum of its motors sounded like a mechanical heartbeat, keeping the warehouse alive. It was clear that this machine was the sole source of power in the frozen wilderness. Jonas had given me detailed instructions on how to operate the generator and what to do if it failed. Yet there was something unusual about the equipment. It looked overly robust, almost exaggerated, as if it were built to withstand more than just supplying electricity. You won't want it to shut down, Jonas had said before leaving, his tone more of a warning than an instruction. I continued my rounds through the corridors, watching the lights flicker occasionally. Their buzzing was a constant reminder of the one rule that seemed more important than any other. But as I moved on, an unsettling feeling began to creep over me. It felt like I wasn't alone anymore. Every time I turned corner, it seemed like someone or something was there watching from a distance. Just your imagination, I whispered to myself, trying to shake off the chill running down my spine. That's when I saw it. A shadow. It moved too quickly for me to make out, darting between the metal shelves at the far end of the corridor. My eyes locked onto the spot, waiting for some movement. Nothing. Is someone there? My voice echoed louder than I had intended. Silence was my only answer. Taking a deep breath, I walked toward where I had seen the shadow. My heart thundered in my ears as I swept the corridor with my flashlight. Nothing. Just as I began convincing myself it was only the flickering lights playing tricks on me, a sound made me freeze in place. It was a footstep. Behind me. I spun around so quickly I nearly dropped the flashlight, aiming its beam down the corridor. Again, nothing. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to head back to the quarters. But I couldn't. I had a job to do. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't leave me for the rest of the night. Something or someone was there with me. I was certain of it. The next morning arrived, but the sun seemed non-existent in this place. There was only a subtle shift in the grayness of the sky. My sleep had been brief and restless, haunted by the feeling that something was wrong. Despite my exhaustion, I mustered the courage to confront Mr. Erickson about what had happened. I found him in his office, poring over papers with the same stern, introspective expression he always wore. "I need to talk to you," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. He looked up, showing no sign of surprise. "Go on. I saw something last night. Someone or something in the warehouse. Is there anyone else working here?" He didn't answer right away. He just stared at me with those cold eyes, as if deciding how much he was willing to reveal. After what felt like an eternity, he sighed and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "You'll see. Everyone does," he said, his tone as if it were an inevitability. "Just follow the rule. Keep the lights on." "But what's going on here?" I insisted, my voice rising more than I intended. He simply shook his head and stood up, cutting the conversation short. "Do your job, Miguel, and follow the rule." I returned to my quarters feeling a mix of frustration and fear. Something was deeply wrong with this place, but no one seemed willing to give me a straight answer. When night fell again, I began my shift in the warehouse. The hum of the lights and the deep thrum of the generator were my only companions, but the sensation of being watched had grown stronger. Then the noises began. At first, footsteps. Not mine. Soft but heavy steps echoed through the corridors. I tried to track the sound, but it seemed to shift every time I approached. Then came the whispers. Indistinct words, almost like children's voices, but warped and unnatural. "Just your mind playing tricks," I muttered to myself, though my voice trembled. The next sound was the most disturbing. Something scraping against the walls, like claws dragging across concrete. The noise was so sharp it sent my heart racing. I followed the sound with my flashlight, trying to find its source. When I turned a corner, I froze. There were claw marks on several boxes. Deep, long, irregular gashes, as though made by something far too large to be human. I approached cautiously, running my fingers over the marks. Their depth was unnerving, and the thought that something powerful enough to make them was in this warehouse made the air feel heavier. I glanced around, searching for any movement or shadow, but the corridor was empty. Only the flicker of the lights and my own pounding heartbeat filled the silence. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, that maybe it was some sick prank, but deep down I knew. Something was here, something that didn't belong. And this was only the beginning. The storm hit by late afternoon, and the wind howled like a wild creature, flinging snow against the warehouse windows with a force that seemed determined to tear them apart. I had never seen anything so violent. The darkness outside was absolute, and the generator's drone echoed louder than ever, a constant reminder that it was the only thing keeping chaos at bay. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights continued, but now it felt different, unstable, as if the storm outside was affecting them. I walked the corridors, checking boxes and stockpiling my fear with every shadow that moved around me. Then, a deafening crack split the air, followed by absolute silence. The generator had stopped. The lights went out. Darkness fell like a heavy curtain, erasing every point of reference. My breath caught in my chest, and for a moment, all I could hear was the wind roaring outside. The warehouse, oppressive even with the lights on, now felt like an endless abyss. "No, no, no," I muttered, fumbling for my flashlight. My hand shook so badly, I almost dropped it. When I finally turned it on, the beam sliced through the darkness, but felt weak, powerless against the vastness of the warehouse. That's when I felt it. Something cold. A chill so intense it seemed to seep through my clothes and bite at my skin. It wasn't the cold of the wind or snow. It was different, almost alive. Suddenly, I felt a tug on my jacket. It wasn't gentle, like catching on something. It was strong, almost violent, as though something had grabbed me. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the corridors. Silence answered, heavy and suffocating. My flashlight shook as I swept the beam in every direction. Nothing. Only shadows, shifting and dancing as the light flickered. But the feeling of being watched was so intense it felt like a weight pressing on my back. The generator roared back to life, and the lights flickered before stabilizing again. When the warehouse was fully illuminated, I was alone. Or, at least that's what it seemed. I looked down and noticed something that chilled me more than the cold itself. My jacket was torn. It wasn't a small cut. It was a long, jagged slash, as if sharp claws had ripped through it. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation. Maybe I had brushed against something without realizing it, but there was nothing around me that could have caused it. Nothing human, at least. Before I could process it, I heard hurried footsteps. I turned, and Erickson was running toward me. His face, usually so composed, was pale, and his wide eyes conveyed something I didn't want to acknowledge: fear. "The generator failed," he said, trying to catch his breath. "I know," I replied, pointing to my torn jacket. Something was here. It grabbed me." He looked at the rip in my jacket, but didn't seem surprised. In fact, it felt like he already knew what had happened. "You were lucky," he said finally, his voice low and tense. "Ella lucky? How is this luck?" I stammered, adrenaline still coursing through my veins. He grabbed my shoulders, his grip firm and his eyes piercing. "If it happens again, there won't be a way back." "But what is going on here?" I snapped, my patience unraveling. "What was that? What's in this warehouse?" Erickson took a deep breath, but didn't answer. His eyes darted around, as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. "Just follow the rule, Miguel," he said at last. "That's all that matters. Keep the lights on." Before I could say anything else, he turned and walked away quickly, leaving me alone in the corridor. The warehouse felt colder, more hostile now. Every buzz from the lights sounded like a countdown. And for the first time, I realized Erickson's words weren't just a warning. They were a desperate plea. After that night, the silence between me and Erickson became unbearable. I needed answers. The warehouse, the absurd rule, the shadows, and the cold that felt almost alive. All of it was pushing my sanity to its limit. I waited until the next evening, when Erickson came by for a routine inspection. He looked as exhausted as I felt, but there was something else in his eyes. Fear, deep and unrelenting. "We need to talk," I said, blocking his path before he could leave again. He sighed and gave me a weary look. "I've already told you everything you need to know, Miguel. Follow the rule, and you'll be safe." "Safe?" I shot back, holding up my torn jacket as proof. "You think this is safety? Something is here, Erickson. Something that shouldn't be. I deserve to know what's going on." For a moment I thought he would brush me off again, but then he glanced around, as if checking to see if someone or something was listening. "Come with me," he said, motioning with his head. I followed him to his office, a small, dimly lit room crammed with old maps, yellowed documents, and faded photographs. He locked the door behind us, and the sound of the bolts sliding into place felt like crossing an invisible threshold. He pulled out a chair and motioned for me to sit. "If I tell you this, Miguel, you won't be able to forget it. You'll live with it like I do. Are you sure you want to know?" I nodded, my determination stronger than my fear. He took a deep breath and began. "Decades ago, this place was just a stopover for scientific expeditions. Geologists, biologists, people eager to explore the Arctic. One of those expeditions disappeared entirely. About 20 men. No explanation, no trace. Just silence." He pointed to a photograph on the desk. It showed a group of smiling men, bundled in heavy jackets, holding flags and scientific tools. Months later, some of those men reappeared. Erickson continued. But they weren't the same. Their eyes, they had no life in them. They mumbled nonsense. Spoke of a presence. Something that lived in the darkness. Something? I interrupted, my voice weaker than I expected. Erickson nodded, his gaze fixed on the photograph. They said there was something in the shadows. Something that watched them, hunted them. But only when the lights went out. During the day, they were safe. But at night was different. I swallowed hard, but let him continue. The few survivors said that when their generator failed, they heard the first footsteps. At first distant, then closer. And then the screams. They never saw what it was, only felt the cold, heard the sound, and watched their companions vanish one by one. And what does this have to do with the warehouse? I asked, my mind racing in every direction. Erickson hesitated before answering, as if the words were difficult to say. This warehouse was built on the site of that last expedition. It's as if they're still here, trapped, or maybe guarding what's theirs. They? My voice nearly faltered as I uttered the word. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something like sadness in his eyes. They, whatever stayed in the shadows. I don't know if they're spirits, creatures, or something beyond our understanding. All I know is that since then there's been one rule. The lights must never go out. The room felt colder now, as if even speaking about it had drawn the attention of whatever was out there. If the lights go out, he continued, they come, and they take what they consider theirs. I sat in silence, trying to process everything. The fear I had felt over the past nights now seemed justified, but also more unbearable. Why doesn't anyone shut this place down? I asked, almost pleading for a logical answer. Erickson just shook his head. Some secrets can't be buried. They're here. They've always been here. We just keep the lights on to maintain the peace. For a moment, it all made sense, and at the same time, it felt absurd. It was a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. If the generator fails again, Miguel, he said, looking straight at me, don't try to fix it. Run. Run to the quarters, lock the doors, and don't look back. The nights in the warehouse were becoming harder to endure. Even with the lights on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there with me. It was as if the walls were breathing, the air around me heavy with an unseen, oppressive presence. The shadows began to change. They were no longer just the result of flickering fluorescent lights. Some seemed to move independently, sliding along the shelves and floors as if they were alive. More than once, I swore I saw a shadow cross a corridor ahead of me, but when I ran to check, there was never anything there. My sanity was slipping, but fear and curiosity kept me alert. I needed to understand what was happening in this place. That's when I decided to search the warehouse's old records. I remembered Erickson's office, filled with papers and photographs, and figured if there were answers to what I was experiencing, they would be there. I waited until Erickson was out and snuck into his office. I closed the door behind me and began sifting through the scattered documents. Maps, delivery records, inventory lists. At first glance, everything seemed ordinary, until I found a locked drawer. I glanced around and, luckily, found a key hidden under a pile of papers. When I opened the drawer, a chill ran down my spine. Inside were old reports, some yellowed with age, bearing seals and official stamps that hinted at an unusual level of secrecy. I started reading. The first documents were incident reports. Small accidents, generator failures, equipment breakdowns. But then, the entries began to change. One described an incident from decades ago. Generator failure at 11:45 p.m. Lights out for 15 minutes. 2 employees missing. Search efforts unsuccessful. Another report mentioned something even more unsettling. Employee reported hearing voices during night shift. Subsequent electrical system failure resulted in multiple unidentified shadows. Body discovered the following morning. Extensive mutilation. Origin unknown. My stomach churned as I read this. I kept flipping through the reports, each one darker than the last, until I found one that made my blood run cold. It was about an employee named Gregor. The entry was disturbingly detailed, almost as if the writer had taken grim satisfaction in documenting everything with precision. Gregor failed to follow protocol. At 2:30 a.m., the lights went out for 8 minutes. Initial reports of scratching sounds and footsteps. Gregor was found the next morning, or what was left of him. Half of his body was missing. The remaining half was frozen, as if it had been left outside in the middle of a blizzard. My heart pounded as I read on. The descriptions were too vivid to be mere stories. The mutilations, the inexplicable cold, the shadows. It all pointed to something beyond human understanding. I closed the report with trembling hands and leaned back in the chair, trying to process it all. It was real. Everything Erickson had told me, everything I had seen and felt was true. That's when I noticed a shadow move in the corner of the room. I jumped to my feet, my flashlight aimed at the spot, but there was nothing there. Just the light flickering on the walls. But now I knew. I wasn't alone. That night during my shift, every buzz of the lights felt like a countdown. Every shadow seemed closer. And for the first time I truly felt that maybe, just maybe, I wouldn't leave this place alive. The tension in the warehouse was unbearable. After everything I had uncovered, every sound felt magnified. Every shadow felt alive. But what unsettled me the most was the generator. It had begun failing more frequently. The first failure that night lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to freeze me in fear. The hum of the motor stopped, and the flickering lights plunged the warehouse into a terrifying silence. When the generator roared back to life, I felt relieved, but I knew it was only the beginning. My job was simple: keep the lights on. But how could I do that with the generator teetering on the brink of collapse? I made my way to the generator room, my heart pounding like a drum in my ears. The motor hummed, but it was unstable, letting out metallic clicks and groans I hadn't heard before. I grabbed the tools Jonas had left and tried to recall the instructions he gave me on my first day. As I worked on the cables and panels, I heard something. It was faint at first, barely perceptible. A whisper. "Miguel." I froze, thinking my mind was playing tricks on me, but the sound came again, clearer this time. "Miguel." I swallowed hard and turned, gripping my flashlight tightly. The beam illuminated the corridor behind me, but there was nothing there. Only shadows shifting as the lights flickered. "Miguel, are you alone?" The voice was cold, hollow, almost mocking. My breath caught in my throat, and panic surged through my mind. I slammed the generator panel shut and ran, not caring if the repair was complete or not. At the end of one corridor, I found a small room equipped with its own emergency light and locked myself inside. My body trembled as I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. "This can't be happening," I muttered to myself. The light on the ceiling buzzed softly, but it was comforting, a reminder that there was still something between me and the absolute dark. I grabbed the radio to call Erickson, but the signal was dead. Then, the sound I dreaded most came. The generator shut down completely. The light in the room went out, plunging me into total darkness. I was paralyzed, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. My eyes strained to adjust, but the darkness was so thick it seemed to swallow me whole. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow and heavy, as if something massive was walking down the corridor just outside. My body was frozen, but my mind screamed at me to do something, anything. I took a deep breath and reached for my flashlight, fumbling to turn it on. When the beam of light finally flickered to life, the room around me was empty, but the sounds persisted. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the door. Then I heard breathing. It was low and deep, but inhuman, like the sound of a massive predator sizing up its prey. I gripped the flashlight so tightly my hands ached, pointing it at the door as if the fragile beam could shield me from whatever was out there. The breathing grew louder, heavier, as though the thing outside could sense my fear. "Go away," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The door creaked slightly, as if something was pressing against it. I stepped back slowly, my flashlight trembling in my grip. Suddenly, the sound stopped. The silence was deafening, but it brought no relief. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Then I heard the most terrifying sound of all, a laugh. It wasn't human. It was low, guttural, like the creature was amused by my fear. The light in the room flickered briefly, and for a split second I saw it. A shadow, massive, misshapen, with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. I screamed and pressed myself against the opposite wall, turning off the flashlight in a desperate attempt not to draw more attention. The warehouse was now completely still, but I knew whatever it was still out there. The silence was broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing. The darkness around me felt suffocating, and the sense of being watched was unbearable. My trembling fingers fumbled through my pockets, searching for the lighter I always carried. When I finally managed to ignite it, the small flame cast a dim glow, barely enough to illuminate a few inches in front of me. Every step I took felt heavier, as if the entire warehouse was conspiring to keep me there. "I need to get the generator back on," I whispered to myself, trying to ignore the echo of my own voice. I moved through the corridors, feeling the cold intensify with every step. My body was drenched in sweat, but the icy air seemed to seep straight through my skin. The flickering flame of the lighter cast grotesque shadows on the walls. And then I saw it. Just a glimpse, but it was enough to freeze me in place. At the end of the corridor, a tall, misshapen figure appeared for a brief moment before melting back into the shadows. Its eyes glowed like embers, and even in the dim light, I could make out sharp, jagged teeth meant for tearing flesh. "This can't be real," I murmured, stepping back instinctively. But the sound of heavy footsteps snapped me back to reality. The creature was moving, and it was coming in my direction. My survival instincts kicked in. I ran down the corridors, clutching the lighter in one hand, while using the other to guide myself along the shelves and walls. Finally, I spotted the generator room. I slipped inside and slammed the door shut, locking it quickly. The sound of the bolt sliding into place felt insignificant against the crushing weight of fear. The room was as dark as the rest of the warehouse, and the familiar hum of the generator was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. My hands worked frantically, opening the generator panel. I could barely see what I was doing, but I clung to the instructions Jonas had given me. Check the cables, turn the main valve, press the reset button. The lighter's flame wavered as I worked, casting eerie shadows that seemed to stretch and move on their own. My breaths came in shallow gasps as I located the main valve and twisted it. The metallic groan echoed in the silence. Come on," I muttered, searching for the reset button. Before I could press it, the sound returned. The laugh. It was louder this time, echoing around the room as if the creature were standing right behind me. My blood turned to ice as I realized the door I had locked moments ago was now creaking. Something was inside the room with me. As I struggled to restart the generator, a sound made my heart stop. Knocking. It started soft, almost delicate, but quickly turned into violent pounding. The door groaned under the pressure, as if it were moments away from giving way. "Not now, please not now," I muttered, sweating as I twisted the valve. The pounding grew more intense, accompanied by an inhuman sound, a guttural growl from the other side. Heavy breathing, scratching, and a metallic noise that resembled claws scraping against the door. Come on," I shouted at the generator, slamming the reset button. Nothing. A loud thud followed, as though something massive was throwing its weight against the door. It buckled slightly, and through the narrow gap I saw them. The glowing eyes, fixed on me, hungry and unrelenting. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to run, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus and tried again. Twisting the valve with all my strength, I pressed the reset button. This time, the generator roared to life, its metallic hum echoing through the room. The warehouse lights flickered, then stabilized, flooding the room with their fluorescent glow. The sounds outside stopped abruptly. The pounding ceased, and silence returned, though it felt heavier than before, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath, but I knew this wasn't over. Not as long as I remained in this place. With trembling hands, I grabbed the key to the door, ready to leave. But one question haunted me. What if they were still out there, waiting in the next shadow? The generator's steady hum filled the deadly silence of the warehouse. Its metallic rhythm was the only thing keeping me sane. The flickering fluorescent lights cast their glow throughout the building, forcing the shadows into the corners. But I knew they were still there. The creatures had retreated, but they hadn't disappeared entirely. Occasionally, I'd catch movement in the corner of my eye, too quick to fully see, but enough to send chills down my spine. Were they just shadows? I tried to convince myself they were. When I thought the worst was over, I heard footsteps echoing down the corridor. Gripping my flashlight with shaking hands, I aimed it at the doorway. The door creaked open slowly, and for a moment my heart stopped. It was Erickson. He looked exhausted, but not afraid. His face bore the weight of tension, but not panic. His eyes scanned the room, lingering on the now-functioning generator before settling on me. "You did it," he said flatly. "What the hell were those things?" I snapped, my voice trembling with both anger and fear. "They were going to kill me. You knew this would happen, and you left me here." He sighed and sat on a crate near the generator. "I warned you, Miguel. I told you to keep the lights on. That's the only thing keeping us alive here." "That's not enough," I shouted. "You knew about them, about what happens when the generator fails. You knew, and you still brought me here." For a moment, he remained silent, staring at the floor. Then he looked up, his face lined with resignation. "Do you think I want to be here? Do you think any of us do? We don't have a choice. The contract binds us." "Literally, contract?" I asked, confused. He nodded and pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. It was a copy of the same contract I had signed before accepting the job. He handed it to me, and as I read the fine print, my blood ran cold. There was a clause I hadn't noticed before. Termination of the contract is only permitted upon full completion of the agreed term. Any attempt to violate this clause will result in immediate and permanent measures. "Permanent measures?" I murmured, looking up at him. Erickson's face was grim. "They don't let you leave, Miguel. Not alive, at least." "They don't let anyone leave before the term is up," Erickson replied, his voice low. "The creatures, they're part of it. They're part of this place. I don't know what they are or where they came from, but they're here, protecting something we can't understand." "How long do I have to stay?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He looked at me with an expression that bordered on pity. "You signed for 6 months." 6 months. 6 months in this hell, battling fear, shadows, and the creatures that waited in the darkness. My mind raced, trying to think of an escape, but with every passing moment, it felt more and more like I was trapped. "What if I try to run?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Erickson shook his head. "You won't get far. They know when someone tries to escape. You've seen what happens when the lights go out. Do you think you'd have any chance in the dark out there?" I fell silent, the weight of the truth crushing me. I wasn't held by locks or chains, but by something far more powerful and terrifying. Erickson stood, placing a hand on my shoulder. "You're strong, Miguel. Stronger than most who've come through here. Just keep the generator running, follow the rule, and maybe you'll survive." He started to leave, but paused at the door. "Oh, and one more thing. Don't trust everything you see. Sometimes they like to play games." I was alone in the room, the hum of the generator filling the oppressive silence. My hands trembled as I put away the tools. The contract I had signed, the promise of a generous paycheck, it all felt meaningless now. The only question that lingered in my mind was, how long could I survive? As the screen faded to black, one final thought echoed in my mind. Would you take a job like this? For the money or for your life? If you're ever told a rule is for your safety, believe it. You might find out too late what happens when it's broken. If you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your participation is essential for us to continue bringing more stories like this. Activate the bell so you don't miss the next videos, and remember, sometimes the mystery is closer than we think. See you next time.